We're going to kick off, before we do a round of introductions, and we're going to have a quick provocation here from James Hodge. James, do you want to just take us away?
Yeah, certainly. So we're talking about the progress in data and tech for good. It's a really interesting topic. I thought I'd start with talking about what it means to be educated, or education itself. There's a term called constructivism. I might struggle on a few words today by the sounds of it. Which is essentially taking the building block approach. Think about how do you learn. If only you've got children or remember back to school, it is you're layering on your approach to that education. But all of that, and a great bit about it, is that really depends on your perceived reality and what you currently think about. There is one fact I can tell you today, is you're going to learn something. Your perception of the world is going to change in the next 45 minutes. It may be infinitesimally small. You may decide, I like James, I don't like James, this is a great panel, this is not a great panel, but something is going to change. So the next time you make a decision, something will be different about it to the decision you would have made a few minutes ago, potentially. Then we think about that kind of building blocks of education is how long does a fact actually remain? I think we've got the whole concept of fake news and facts is pretty much out there in the open. And there's this thing about knowledge and the half-life of knowledge. In 1930, the average half-life of a fact in an engineering degree was 35 years. In 1960, that is 10 years. If you now think about the technology industry and just AI and the ethical debate, I think a fact and something that we hold as a true belief, I would say we can probably measure that in months or maybe up to a year as we go through this conversation. And that then gets onto that concept of education and the half-life of fact and something known true is this concept of a goal and bias. So we did a test. If I were to ask everyone here in the audience to independently turn off the lights, how would you do that? Most people, it's a really simple goal. Turn off the lights. Most people go, I know how to do that. I stand up, I walk over, and I press the light switch. We did a Bring Your Kids to School day recently. So I asked the same question to a group of children ranging between 8 to 14. No one said stand up and press the light. We started off with the active child that said, I would smash the lights. That would turn it off. You never told me I have to turn them back on again. Oh, I didn't think about that. Someone said we need to build a robot. Someone said we need to throw water at it. That then got taken a step further by another child that said we need to throw acid at it. So we very much kept him in the corner. One exasperated girl just looked around at everyone like they were stupid and said, it's easy, you just ask Alexa. And that super clear goal, turn off the light, was so easily misinterpreted from what I thought people would say into what they would actually do. So think about goals in your world, and when we talk about what is good in the tech for good debate, is that goal clear? Is it super clear? Would my children come up with the same approach as I would? Which then gets back to that concept of societal norms. We have social beliefs. They come in kind of two facts. We've got the social norms, which is about what is typical in that society, what is appropriate for that society. And then we have the non-social personal beliefs. What are my attitudes? What are my factual beliefs and moral beliefs? The company I work for is a multinational company. So the ethics that we talk about and my team talk about is going to be different, and our approach in what is good in the UK versus maybe my colleague in America or my colleague in Singapore. We have different norms that we work to, so how do we think about it? And I think finally when we talk about good, you've got to explore humanity. What does it really mean to be human? And I couldn't help but to come up, I think we talked about Terminator earlier. I've gone for HAL 9000. Potentially my favorite film, because my wife can't stand it, so I get complete peace and quiet as she will go off in the rest of the room. But the whole kind of, the central unifying theory about that is about evolution and advancement. There are 3 or 4 core themes to it. The moon monolith, the expedition, the crew termination, and the eventual switch off of HAL. And it's a really interesting exploration because it talks about the perceived weakness in humanity. HAL was infallible. It had never made a mistake. It was a robot. How could it make a mistake? And we took that thing that it was weak to be human. And actually what it really turned out to as HAL started taking more inputs and realizing that his goal, protect the mission, no longer needed the crew, and he didn't like lying to the crew and the crew weren't there, HAL started to adapt. And you have that iconic scene at the end where HAL is pleading with Dave after the kind of bit where, HAL, open the pod door base, please. I'm sorry, Dave, I cannot do that. As HAL's bias and his perception of reality changes. So I really think when we think about ethics and the tech for good and what technology can do for good, we really need to sit about what is our core goal? What is our purpose? Why are we applying AI? Does that really apply to that goal that we have as a company or a mission or what we're trying to achieve? And what does good mean and whose good are we defining? Thank you.
Great, thank you, James. Okay, so what we're going to do now is just do a quick round of introductions. I'm going to ask each of the panelists to share in 2 or 3 minutes a bit about their work and to just introduce themselves. To kick off, I'm Johnny Penn. I'm based at the University of Cambridge. I study the history of artificial intelligence. And I sit between 2 communities. I co-organize a series of workshops on AI for social good at NeurIPS, ICML, ICLR, the kind of technical AI conferences. And I also engage with the critical community. And it's a weird position to sit between these 2 sides because the critics say, we're not getting anywhere, and the engineers say, we're really moving. And some of those contradictions I hope we can get into on stage here about tech for good, that kind of expression. So to start, Sharif, would you take us away?
Sure. Thank you very much, Johnny. So I'm Sharif Saidali. I work with Element AI. So we are just a very quick introduction about who we are. We are a Canadian headquarters startup. We're also present in London. We essentially do research from fundamental AI research up to applied applications and applied research to real-world applications and enterprise products. We essentially support various kinds of organizations to put AI into operations, build a strategy, and deploy it within their business. We do that for the commercial sector, public sector, but we also do that with nonprofits and international organizations. So we work essentially in the, let's say, the AI for good space. I know there's lots of issues with the name and what it means and all of that. Our goal is, and we define it very specific, a bit more specifically, is to support organizations working towards climate action and human rights action. Also work a bit in the development space. But what we do is provide the develop technology solutions to solve specific needs and specific problems that these organizations face, or rather than problems, essentially provide tools that enable them to do their work more efficiently, at a bit larger scale, more rapidly, and potentially find new ways of doing the kind of research, campaigning, any kind of work that they do. Just kind of in response, perhaps a little bit to James's provocation, it's
going to have to be quick because we have to get through everybody first.
No, absolutely. Is that we look at 3 things that help us kind of as a basis points, and these are the 3 international frameworks. We look at the international human rights framework, the Paris Agreement, and the Sustainable Development Goals as a starting point for how we define good.
Great, that was quick. Okay, Maria, would you go next, please?
Yeah. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Johnny. Although my title is different from the organization I represent today, I will do my best to explain what AI Commons is. So I come today as the new Director of Outreach for AI Commons, it's not this new, non-for-profit that was established out of AI for Good Summit in Geneva, and brings together some of the best minds in AI. As a founder, we have Yoshua Bengio, Stuart Russell, and Francesca Rossi, and many organizations, including Element AI, Mila, and including Sharif and Johnny, and hopefully many, many more of you. What's the purpose? What's the mission we've established for AI Commons? Is to create a knowledge hub, a community where we connect those problem owners in the AI for good space with the solution owners. Because we know there are on one side, there are a lot of enthusiasm and desire to solve some of the humanity biggest problems and to address your provocation and build on what Sharif said. We are using the same definition of AI for good as United Nations, which is using AI to address or to solve sustainable development goals. They have a very clear target by 2030. With solution owners, so matching problem owners with solution owner. In the solution owners, it's almost anyone who has an asset or capability or knowledge or relationship that will help someone in a field in Uganda, scale, build, connect, and scale their problem. And hopefully through the question, I will be able to talk more about it. In the remaining time, I do lead the AI for Good and Responsible AI in PwC, but it's not what I would want to talk about it today.
A woman that wears many hats. All right, James, do you have any more introductions you would like to make?
I'll just very quickly kind of introduce Splunk. What we really do is capture. Think of data. When I grew up, I didn't think about looking at log files for a living. I don't think any small child would ever think like that. I want to be a policeman, a fireman, an astronaut, something like that. But when we really think about what Splunk is we've got this platform that allows me to bring that data in and think about it in a different way. For me, what data really represents is a record of an interaction that took place somewhere in the world that someone initiated, a human initiated. And when we think about that, I can now start to put it with different lenses, and we really focus on what is that outcome that I can take that data and how do I make that tangible for someone. And in the social good kind of forum, we pledge $100 million for what we call Splunk for Good, which is education, social initiatives, then a further $50 million on a social impact fund. We work with organizations like the California wildfires to look at how can we support an organization to be able to get those leading indicators to allow someone to make better decisions that maybe impact someone's life. I think that there is so much power in data and what it can be used for good. If I start to think about it, this is not data, this is a representation of something that's happening in the world that I can now make a decision on.
Great, thank you. Sudan.
Thank you. So I'm Sutan Yang from Social Tech Trust. And Social Tech Trust, you might have known us formerly as Nominet Trust. We spun off from Nominet last year. And our vision is a world where social transformation drives technology. What that means is basically that we think right now the rhetoric is a little bit backwards with technology for tech's sake. And what we should really focus on is underlying people and the social problems that we want to solve. And then technology evolves from there. Because at the end of the day, we are the creators and the users of that technology. So if we focus on the humans and the problem, when we create the technology, then it's much more user-friendly, and it really solves our problems rather than creating kind of a tech divide and having to learn how to use this tech that we've created. And so my background, actually, I was new to this sector, so I've only kind of joined Social Tech Trust and the social sector in April of this year. So my background is actually 12 years at JP Morgan, doing a hedge fund investment analyst, so I bring probably a slightly different view to the debate. And our connection, actually, to AI for Good is we currently run the AI for Good Accelerator with Microsoft. So we probably bring a bit more practical case studies and examples of what ventures do. So my position there is I'm a portfolio manager, and I have the honor and the pleasure of working with lots of startup founders on their solutions.
Morning, everyone. I'm Ian Caveney from BT. So I've actually got Tech for Good in my title, but one of the things I try to do when I'm working with colleagues or with different stakeholders is actually try to avoid to use the word Tech for Good, because I think one of the important things is actually looking at how you can be more specific about the areas of action that you're trying to take. So within my role, there's 3 core areas that I look to sort of commercialize and drive within BT, and that's also come from the fact I work in the sustainability team. So the first area is looking at how we can use smart city technology, 5G, to actually help fight the climate crisis. So really very specific view on how we can use technology, AI, to actually help fight the climate crisis. Second area is looking at how we can use AI and connected devices to actually support the UK's aging population, so looking at sort of health-led propositions, be that consumer-led or through public sector organisations. And I think the third role, which is actually probably one of the more interesting side of roles is actually looking at how we can actually inspire people around what is possible with technology. And I think for me, that's one of the critical things that we often miss, is actually looking at how we can inspire not only young people, but the whole population around what is actually possible with technology. So actually finding great stories, great examples of what is actually possible with tech is one of the key things that I think we need to be looking to do.
Great, thanks, Ian. And you're always on Twitter, I understand as well. Is that right?
Well, not always, just a bit.
Okay. Okay, so my aim here is to actually turn this back over to you guys so you can ask your questions, but just to kind of get us there, I'd love to go through some of what we've agreed to talk about on the panel. And my first question, I guess, for you, Sharif, is, we ask, do we have a moral obligation to use advanced tech for good, even if this may raise some ethical concerns? And I want to add a spin to that question. I want you to answer first as if we're talking about microwaves, and then second as if we're talking about artificial intelligence, because I want to know what concessions we make when we assume good just because it's AI, whereas we wouldn't if it was a microwave.
Microwave is a microwave oven?
That's, yeah, the scientist of the group, yeah.
Okay, if it's a microwave, I mean, yeah, why not? If it's got a use for people, but at the same time, I don't know that much about microwaves. I guess we just need to be careful in how powerful these devices are, because they could harm people, and the protections, like how it's enclosed so that the radiation is not.
I didn't mean to put you on the spot. Well, I did mean to put you on the spot, actually. But the idea is, the question is, why accept the moral hazards with AI? Why is AI exceptional?
I don't think it is.
Is exceptional? Yeah.
It's not. I don't think it is. I think the fact that there is technology that can help us achieve socially, social good, and we kind of keeping aside how we define it, I think means that we should try to use it. We should see how we can use it for that purpose. Now, having said that, it doesn't mean that we just use it without thinking through what it does, what the potential implications are, because everything can have negative implications. So I think it's incumbent on us, together with that, I think, moral obligation to try and use it, is also to do that responsibly. And that means, first of all, really understanding what the problem that we're trying to solve is, whether technology has a role to play in there, and what the adequate role is, and then looking at the potential risks and seeing if we can mitigate them. And if we can, then we don't do it.
Okay, so you guys do have some sort of accountability measures where you say AI isn't the right thing to use to solve this social problem?
I mean, what we absolutely do is that we first, there's this quote from Einstein. I'm not completely sure it's definitely him who said that, but that if I had to solve an hour to solve a problem, I would spend 55 minutes thinking about the problem and 5 minutes thinking about the solution. And I think what it says, and this is very much how we think about it, is that we need to understand the problem first. And so many social problems, the first solution to them has nothing to do with technology. It has to do with public policies. It has to do with social attitudes, economic factors, and we need to look at these first. And sometimes technology has a role to play as an enabler, as something that helps the solution, and sometimes it doesn't. And there's no point in trying to force through technology just for the sake of it.
Great. Okay, Sutan, I see you nodding. Do you want to walk us through how you guys do this? Because you're actually paying in a...
Yeah, I mean, I think...
Oh, sorry, I can get to you. I was wanting to ask Sutan first just because I saw her nodding along.
Sorry, so yeah, I completely agree with you that it really comes from examining the problem and really understanding it from the user's point of view in all facets of the problem, because it might not be a straight tech solution. And like you said, sometimes it could be public policy needs to change, or the solution is not obvious straight tech fix. What if the people can't use the tech that you've created?
Can I ask, though, specifically, can you give us some of the examples of tools that you guys are actually funding right now, like how this is touching the ground?
Yeah, so for example, one of the tools in our last AI for Good cohort is WeWalk, which is a smart cane for the visually impaired. And what they do, they've come out of previously from the Young Gurus Academy in Turkey, which is an organization focused on working on creating products and solutions for the visually impaired. So they have a genuine user engagement focus on creating their product, which means they do a lot of work along with the visually impaired people to see what are actually their problems and what would really help them. And then they test these solutions with them. even if it's prototypes. So you can kind of see what the unintended consequences are of what you've created, and if it's actually solving their problem in the way that you wanted it to. So it's really engaging the user, and not just in the creation journey, but throughout the usage and throughout the lifetime of it. Because the other thing is sometimes the unintended consequences, like microwaves giving off, radiation or something, we don't realize that until further on. So you need to continue to have that user engagement, not just throughout the life cycle of the product, but afterwards as well. And that way you can continually improve the product and make sure it really is solving the solution as you intended it to.
Right. You don't mean to say, though, that radiation is part of the user engagement?
It's something.
Yeah, I hear you. Well, Ian, you were going to respond, and then Maria, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think I was just going to sort of go back to the point that was raised earlier, just about the fact that the UN's human rights are basically the foundation of what everybody should be working to, and just because something can deliver a business or social benefit, if it goes against somebody's individual human rights, then actually you've got to really consider whether you go ahead or not. And I think that's something that actually guides a lot of what we develop within BT. And I think if you have that as your starting point, that's always really important. But I think the other thing is to look at, again, sort of building on what Sunit said, is actually think about the kind of stakeholders you engage with. So we have lots of what we call customer inclusion panels, where we bring in experts from, for example, the disability sector, when we're looking at how accessible our products are, how we can improve that accessibility. So I think it's bringing the people you're trying to sort of support into your environment in terms of your product development and as part of those processes, and you make that the norm. And you'll never completely overcome all unintended consequences, but you can certainly mitigate a lot of those factors.
Right, but we also know now, and Maria, I'll let you jump in, but just quick comment that, in the earlier panel, we heard about data trusts, and we hear about citizen juries and ways of kind of using inclusion to balance some of the harms. It seems to me with one of the challenges behind those proposals is it's a big administrative burden that we're taking on, and it may not be clear that the addition of AI plus that administrative burden actually makes the situation better. And it's also, for a citizen jury, if that work is unpaid, then it's kind of offsetting onto the public the labor to maintain a quality product. I'll come back to that point, but Maria, I hear your thoughts.
I want to build what Sharif said about the huge economic impact. So when we look in the industry, in order to understand the impact of AI, companies like PwC and many others have run extensive studies to understand what's the economical impact of AI, how much value we actually generate. And everyone came with their own figures. Is $13.5 trillion by 2030, or even lower or higher figures? I don't think that the figure is important. It's important that ultimately is going to have an impact on the overall economy. But that promise of generating more value comes with associated risk. And again, in the industry, we tend to be much more grounded in the reality rather than talk about existential risks, dystopian and extremist scenarios of robots going to take our jobs, or AI is going to develop consciousness. We have developed a set of risks that talk about performance, security, and privacy and stability and cybersecurity, but also risk related to economic impact, societal, ethical, and now environmental. What we haven't done, and I think that's a room for it, is how do we model the impact of all those solutions, either in the social space or the industry space, in order to understand the impact on the direct user and indirect users. And I know that the German Data Ethics Commission have released a report in mid-October where they are proposing that, for example, regulation around AI should actually look at a scale of 1 to 5 of impact of those technologies. So, for example, in category 1, you'll have a soap dispenser. So it doesn't have a lot of impact, therefore maybe we don't read regulation. But on the other extreme, you have someone like autonomous weapons that have a severe impact on a large groups of population, and potentially that should be banned. And to end up, what I wanted to say is what we try to do at AI Commons is to look at the best practices and the framework the industry have developed over the years working with AI and apply that to social context. Because we know the industry is very careful when it comes to quality, control of AI, embedding ethics. So we need, and will work together to translate that knowledge into the social space. Because if one application in the for-profit can benefit of that, why not the social environment where we know the impact is much more profound and much more severe?
So, and I want to go back to you. You're dealing with these questions every day. What steps do you kind of take, and what would you recommend other people? What steps should other people take?
Well, a lot of it comes from basically a lot of education internally around issues such as human and digital rights with the staff, and especially the staff who are involved in sort of developing the technology. So, for example, in terms of a lot of the forums that we have internally, that the people who manage our human rights and digital ethics from a sustainability perspective are always sat directly with the product development teams in terms of forums, etc. So we're always making sure that we are at the table in these forums, etc. internally. And I think a lot of it is just about the governance and the checks you have in place. And it takes time to do that, but you should always be reviewing as to kind of, well, are we missing anything? And it's kind of that general point of view is that it's hard to stay up to date with all the potential implications of what is happening. So again, conferences like this today are sort of massively important for organisations like BET to kind of learn as to what is happening. We don't have all the answers, so again, how do we go out there and get those answers, and just build it into our governance, because it is kind of, you know, it can mean it takes longer time to get products to market, but then actually you're in a situation where you're getting a better product to market as well at the same time. So yeah, it's just classic governance process, really.
So I'm going to turn it over to the audience in a moment here to have your thoughts. I'm curious, a speculative question for the group. So, you know, if it turns out, we already see that technology as it exists today is kind of leading to social stratification through things like inequality. You know, 1% of the global population is going to have 2/3 of the world's wealth in 10 years, and AI, you know, can exacerbate that inequality. We know that the machine learning field is set to potentially have a larger carbon footprint than the aviation sector by next year. And so the material toll and the social toll of these technologies could be very high. What do we do if we find out that technology, at least the kind of realms of technology that we're working in, are like smoking, and that we're up here talking about, you know, the health impact of smoking? If some of this is just kind of inherent to the product, how do you guys respond? What do you recommend in your realms of expertise? Maria's passing off the mic. But, you know, knowing that there are benefits, you know, that there have clearly been benefits. We're all working in those areas. But what do we do about some of those perhaps irremovable challenges?
Yeah, I think this is where the role of government becomes very, very important. Government and international organizations, that we need good AI governance, and that means good checks on what's responsible AI, what it actually means in practice, and how do you define risk, and how do you deal with risk, and what's the acceptable level of doing that? What are the use cases that shouldn't happen, like maybe autonomous weapons, you know, should that be banned or not? And I think there, I mean, one thing that we are advocating quite strongly for is that the human rights framework should be a basis for that. It is, and I think this is the thing with the kind of the whole ethics debate, is that you can say, well, the ethics in this countries are that, or kind of the culture in this country is that, but really the only framework we have for sort of that's about globally agreed ethics in a way is the international human rights framework, and that's the only thing we have that's internationally agreed, and I think that should be the basis. That's a starting point. On the climate, environmental side as well, it's the same. I think we need to look at how to minimize the carbon sort of impact. And there are many ways of doing that, but also, I mean, and one of the first things is actually to measure correctly, and I think some of the figures that we hear are not really that representative or perhaps accurate, and I think the first point of call is to do that, and then seeing how we can minimize them.
So sort of what's behind what you're saying is these contradictory ethical challenges need to be seated in government as opposed to privatized and dealt with kind of outside of the public realm, I mean, passed through the courts, basically. Like I mean, there has to be an understand something that every a level playing field for, like something that's clear for everyone, a set of rules that everyone is able to follow. And one place to start, for example, would be looking at public procurement of AI. You know, that could be the place to demonstrate and to show what are the standards that should be followed. And I kind of believe that looking at the human rights framework as a basis for that is the right place to start. Yeah, let's do Maria and then James. I'd love to hear from you.
That's an excellent point on procurement. And I don't think we talk a lot about procurement of AI. We talk a lot about in-house build, and we're missing the point. And I will also want to specify the World Economic Forum with Office of AI here have been developed a framework of procurement for AI in public services. I'll encourage you to look for it because it's really, really good. To build on what Sharif said, I will go a step ahead and I will say we stop. Right? We stop until we understand what's going on with this technology. And Lord Tim and Clement Jones has drafted a moratorium on facial recognition because we really don't understand what's happening with this technology, where it's being implemented, and who's in control, if anyone is in control. And secondly, ethical principles are useful, but we talk about self-governance. And self-governance, in some cases, doesn't really work. It's enough to read Shoshana Zuboff, The Age of Surveillance Capitalist book, to actually understand that some of the companies, and we're not going to name them, have gone very far in how they're using this technology, the amount of data they have, and the influence they have in certain forums. So the second area we need to work really hard is support the policymakers and the regulators to get their grips of this technology, the impact, and how it needs to be regulated, being the UK Parliament, being ICO, FCA, European Union, and other regulators and legislators around the world. Because again, I repeat clearly, is ethical principles are good, are okay, but only can get us so far. We need justice. We are in a position when we don't need ethics, we need justice.
Yeah, well said. So, James, you are dealing with this, you're dealing with these sort of challenges, I imagine, some of them, with all sorts of industrial players. What's your perspective?
So I think the procurement's the first one. So we worked really extensively with the World Economic Forum on the Fourth Industrial Revolution movement on how does the public sector procure AI. So we think about who's going to lead that, and who's going to lead the light on how you approach it. I think actually government and public sector is a really good place to start. Actually, they can set standards, policies. They can actually start to bring the ethical debate from a better point of neutrality, and we think that's been really important. I think the first question that we really have to look at is why? Why AI? I think most of us here probably remember the Hadoop kind of wave, and then we had the cloud computing, and now we're in the AI. I think if you look at execs on their earnings calls, the public earnings calls, I think it was the OpenAI Institute released a stat. The instance of someone saying AI over big data is 8 times on these earning calls. We were certainly in there, this is just the thing to do. And just why? I think we really encourage our clients and people we work with to start with, well, what could we do first? Do we actually understand the data? What are you trying to do? What's the risks behind it before we even get onto that AI conversation and bring complexity into things?
So would you support Lord Clement Jones' approach of defaulting to restraining deployment on hazardous areas as opposed to allowing it to move forward?
We would, and what we recommend is that point on goals and the light switch is really starting with a pre-mortem. Where could this go wrong? Where's my diversity of data, my diversity of team, my thinking, and am I thinking about this in the right way, and do I need to do this? I think when you can go through that as an educated session, it becomes much easier for you to iterate quickly as you start to deploy that technology, as you start to work through that as part of your business. It's not about AI ethics, it's much more about business ethics. Does this really go into your goals and your purpose behind it? And I think we sometimes abdicate responsibility of business ethics by saying, oh, this is just about AI.
Yeah, and it's a good reminder, this panel itself need not be just about AI. But I'd like to turn the microphone now over to the audience. I believe there's a microphone, or perhaps we can lend one from on stage.
We've got a spare.
I might start with you in the back, and then, we'll start there, and then you'll be next.
Some really good points made by the panel, particularly Maria saying that policymakers should be supported. I really like that. Tim Clement Jones, by the way. But you've talked quite a bit in the context of AI for Good about corporate governance. But in the light of the way that AI potentially, the application of AI potentially could lead to an imbalance of wealth creation and so on. I mean, do you actually think that's going to lead to different corporate structures at the end of the day? I mean, do we need to think much more about things like B Corps? Do we need to think much more about employee share ownership and that sort of broader social agenda? I mean, is this leading really to a bit of a revolution in our thinking about the way we organize ourselves?
So Susan, I might ask you to approach that if you wouldn't mind, because you've got a background in both banking and now doing the kind of tech for good stuff. So what do you think?
Yeah, actually, I really like your question because I do think right now we are in the middle of kind of a change in our corporate thinking. You hear more about stakeholders. So actually, if you only focus on your shareholder, they're not your only stakeholders in your business. Your customers as well are your stakeholders at the end of the day, and you do have a responsibility to them. So this is, again, taking into account kind of not only how do we make our shareholders rich, but how do we actually really enrich and help our users and help the people who pay us money. And again, that goes back to kind of society as well, because as big business, you know, everybody in society becomes your customer. So again, coming with the problem and society in mind, I completely agree with that. If that's keep them in mind when you create whatever you're creating, then you will naturally create something that's beneficial to your end users and keep their best interests at heart. So some of these moral questions are solved along the way because that's your end goal.
Maria, quick response, and then we'll do the next question. I need to hold on to this. I'm sorry. I won't.
I think definitely yes. I think the business leaders and leaders of all organizations need to be prepared for a shake-up, because the promise of AI is not just about generating economical value, it's about disruption. So yes, it's going to disrupt the corporate governance. We need to link it with business and corporate ethics, which some of the corporations have quite a mature understanding. But I think in this space, the C-suite has a very important role. They need to acknowledge that this is coming not just across the value chain, but towards corporate governance. And we need them on side.
Next question.
Thank you. Just coming back to the point about tech for good, that kind of question is, well, who actually defines what good is? Is it, the user? Is it providers? Is it government? Is it society as a whole? And how do we work that through? Take, for example, simple technology like Alexa devices, which are now being deployed in the homes of older, vulnerable adults to support them live independent lives. They are then targeted with very specific advertising and marketing. So, where is that the price we have to pay? Or is this something that we really need to think through a little bit more?
I'll take some of that. I think when we actually look at, I think it's a much broader question about data and use of data. And you think about changing corporate structures and policies and what we really want to do. We've got an obligation to our shareholders in how we conduct our business. But what we really think about, so I was at a leadership offsite yesterday, and we finished with a very emotional session. That we had to write 2 words, I pretend. And then we actually had to start to think, what are the things that how do I actually feel about something? What do I really care about? What is me and why am I here? And when we think about that in terms of a corporation, well, why are our employees here? What is the mission, the purpose behind it, and what do we want to be? So, for example, at Splunk, we've taken the position, we have a SaaS offering. We hold customers' data. But we take the position that, very clearly, we will not use that customer data to go and work out how to sell other services. We could take all of that and provide a security service on top of that, but we've decided that is not what we want to do. And so I think it's each individual, each company being incredibly clear on what are they trying to achieve. Now, you as a consumer may then decide, I don't like that policy and go elsewhere. And hopefully we have enough of an open economy that there is competition, and you do have choice as a consumer to go somewhere else. But I think it really starts a fundamental in changing the democracy inside of our organizations, so it's not just the C-suite, it's the entire organization that is the most important part. At the end of the day, a company is nothing without its people, and its people make the company. I think that has to be at the front of everything we think about.
So I want to follow up on that. This is an open question to everybody. The public has a lot of faith that AI is going to, or there is some faith that AI will bring about, and technology will bring about a better future. And I think some of that faith gets invested in industry, because our experience is that Googles of the world, your guys' organizations, are the ones that are driving these things forward. What I don't hear much of in the corporate space is what corporations can't do. In sociology, there's a convention where you'll start your piece of work saying, this is all my limitations. I had this much time, I had this much funding, and there's all these things I couldn't accomplish. And I feel like we're in a situation, a kind of game theory problem, where if one organization says, okay, I'm not just going to look out for my shareholders, I'm going to look out for the local citizens in my area as well, or whoever my kind of consumer constituents are, they may take themselves down a notch competitively. And so what we need is a systemic solution for all organizations. And one route towards that might be organizations just kind of making explicit, we can't do this. This is not our responsibility. We don't want to allude to it being our responsibility because it's not something that is meant for us. Does any of this ring with what you guys are doing in your organizations? Are there limitations that you make explicit about what you think is your responsibility and what isn't? Sharif, you're nodding. Do you want to take a stab? I have to, just as moderator, I'm holding on to this thing. I'm sorry.
I think... So we of course we have things that we will do and won't do, and every organization will have that. And the thing is, it's important that organizations spend the time and see the value, sort of think about the impact of what they do and their business and their technology, and make sure that they are comfortable with what they're doing and not doing the things that they think they shouldn't. But that's a starting point, but that's never going to be enough, because you have to have something that runs across the board. You have to have something that everyone has to agree to. That's why we have laws on data protection, and all sorts of other things that we all have to follow. And it's the same with whether it's machine learning or any other technology. As long as that standard is not across the board, then maybe we will not do something, but someone else will do it. And if it's not... if there's nothing saying that they can do it, and that's potentially a harmful practice, then it's gonna happen. And so I think it's never going to be enough, and we have to have that common standard across, and that's something that people have to abide by.
And one of the challenges, obviously, is harmonizing that globally, because if the competition is lowered in one country but allowed in other countries, then that disrupts competition. Okay, let's go back to the group. Question here.
Thank you. So Maria in particular, but everybody has kind of mentioned the idea of corporate governance. I'm Caitlin McDonald from the Leading Edge Forum, by the way. And I wonder if you think in this emergent era of technology ethics becoming a more acceptable part of the business conversation in particular, but organizationally more generally, so you could look at regulators, for example. Where does that sit in an organization? So we have the idea of business ethics and compliance. That typically sits with a bunch of lawyers. You have privacy. That typically sits in the technology team. If you want to harmonize your efforts around technology ethics, who's the owner of that? Is there a role emerging there? Is there a discipline emerging there? Is there a team emerging there? What's going on with that?
Maria, because the question was two, I'll start with you, and then Ian,
Yep.
I'd love to hear your perspective.
That's an excellent question. And I think all the big tech companies are struggling to create the organizational structure. On one hand, you look at the corporate and business ethics that have been part of the businesses usually for corporation, and that's why we don't talk about it. Good business is an ethical business. But with the merge of big tech companies that haven't really had to think about it, they are now asking the same question, organizational-wide, from a structure perspective. Who's accountable? Is it the C-suite? Are the data scientists? Or are the business owners? And how do we bring it to life? Because I think we all should be aware that big organizations trigger a lot of complexity. Every new setup or change, it triggers operational costs. So it's not just about the desire to do it, it's also how feasible it is to be done, the cost and the time associated. I would say that ultimately it's very contextual driven. The context defines the organization. In some cases, you'll need to have a chief data officer that is directly accountable to the board, but in some cases, in non-tech companies, you already have the structure. Yes, might sound compliance or legal, and sometimes it doesn't really sound appealing when we talk about ethics, and we've been through a lot of debates if ethics should be aligned with compliance and ethics, but they have good structure. So why not updating it with the tech ethics issue so that we get some traction? Because ultimately with the adoption of technology only accelerating, the worry is that it will take so much longer to set up the organizational structure, and the technology is just going to go like a Formula One car in that direction without any supervision.
Ian?
Yeah, so I think if I look at BT, where I work, I think what's quite interesting is that the leadership actually does start from the top, and they, the C-suite, the CEO, actively support and talk about issues around responsible capitalism, responsible tech. But I think the critical thing is then how that is then actually cascaded through the organization. And I think that, again, has to happen. It's always just making sure that you have specific parts of the business responsible for things, but there's always delivering any product or service. There's so many different parts of the business involved. Is that literally, when it comes to data privacy and data protection, it has to go right from the chief data officer right through to somebody working in a call center. So it really is about how you set up and organize your entire organization. But essentially, if you don't have that leadership and inspiration at the top, then it doesn't happen. So I think that's the critical thing. And again, maybe to build on the points around, do we see what is important to business changing? I would definitely say yes. I think the themes of responsible capitalism, the campaigns by the FT recently, driving this CEO debate. I think if it happens at that level, then that provides inspiration and leadership, I think, for others to follow. And and equally, over a 100-year-old business like BT can learn from B Corps who have been around for 3 to 4 years. So I think it's again just looking at your own circumstance, but make sure that leadership is in place.
So, yeah, I was curious because you actually have a very unique position here that you're deciding which companies to fund or not fund. So you can comment, you can adjudicate which kind of organizational structures deserve our future. But you had another comment. I'm curious to hear your perspective.
So I think it's great that the companies, show leadership from the top, because that's where people take the direction from. And so definitely you need to have a formalized structure. But I also think every individual person, whether it's employee or customer or recipient, has a responsibility as well in that debate. As an employee, you're creating something, and you can affect how it's created. And so you should be thinking about it while you're creating it, what you can build in. The CEO can't come tell you that because they don't know what you're doing. So I think every single person, and in fact, it should trickle down through society as well, through our education systems, through everything we do. It should be taught more in schools as well, and further down, not just in business school, not just in college, maybe even further down in the education system. But I think everybody has a responsibility on it.
I'm going to interpret that as a plug for trade unions because we know that collective action has given us things like the weekend and other great advantages. Okay, other questions from the audience? We have one here in the front, and then we'll go to you, sir. Microphone is just coming to you. Thank you.
Thanks. Kind of picking up on what you said and the flip side of the organizational question, I'm just interested in how you talk about some of this stuff to audiences, to consumers, to people. So how do you talk about ethics and the importance of ethics to people in a way that's compelling? We know, for example, that people say they care about privacy, but in fact are sharing data left, right, and center with all sorts of organizations for the gain of brilliant services through the big tech companies, for example. So how do you translate some of what we're doing on the organizational side to compelling stories and narratives for people?
If it's all right, I would like everybody to answer this very, very briefly. Could we move through the panel? James, do you want to, Ian, take us away.
Yes, I think it is about, to your point, actually finding stories. So similar to the Rewalk stick that Social Tech Trust have been supporting the development through the Tech for Good Awards that we've sponsored for BT. We also found a 9-year-old girl who developed a smart stick after seeing an elderly blind lady step in a puddle. So these are kind of the great ideas and inspirations where you've got a 9-year-old girl developing a smart product after seeing somebody struggle in society. So I think we just have a responsibility to really push those types of stories and to have that kind of inspiration out there.
I think you're right. You really need to focus on the story piece and the human element, which brings it to life for people. Because words like digital ethics or whatnot, it's kind of lofty and hard to relate to. So for us, it's quite easy because we have so many stories from the founders we work with and their inspiration for doing what they do, why they start some of these ventures, and they really have lived experience, whether from a family member or from themselves. So even that's a great story. And then the moving stories from their customers and from the people who they've really helped.
I think just for us very quickly on the organizational structure, we actually separate away from our legal team a separate team called Global Affairs who report into the board to be able to have someone that is not merged by the operational kind of constraints that you get at running a business. They get time to step back. And what they really push as part of that is we're all humans at Splunk. Yes, we work for Splunk, yes, we have our roles, but we are humans. It's that connection that is so important to then get people into that growth mindset, the positivity, and a clear goal of what we are as a collective group of people that are trying to achieve something great in the world. And I think that's so important.
This is going to be my new role in AI Commons. So how do we start communicating since we have a global audience? Through stories, the story of success, and what do we need to make it even more successful? Not to me, it's a good story coming from the people who are on the field and doing it. And that will be the misinformation, the toxic narrative, and so on and so forth. And hopefully by doing this and talking with real people who do real stuff and talk about the impact and the challenges they have, we address more issues than just talking about the ethical challenges, the social for good size, and also generate that movement. And I'm looking, like the example of Greta Thunberg, how she managed to trigger this global revolution. It's not as complicated as we think. We just need to be honest and transparent and tell your story. That's it.
What Maria said.
Since it's come down this way, I'll offer my perspective very briefly, which is, as an academic, I think I take I sit between, working with businesses, but also in academia, and in that community, our stance is often critical. And there's two things I've found to be effective. The first is there's a nice quote by a professor named Ruha Benjamin who says, calls attention to the fact of how many people are living in someone else's imagination. And I think we assume too readily that technology has to be a part of our future, that this is all kind of determined for us already, which historically is totally discredited. The idea of technological determinism is just not taken seriously by historians of technology. There's always people making decisions somewhere. And so the question is, how do we how does the public take back the narratives of what our future looks like? And I think things like moratoriums help get that default where you're going to say, okay, well, we're not going to deploy this technology until you can prove that it's actually better. We're not going to start putting microwaves in every home until you can prove that they're not going to blow up. That's our minimum threshold. And AI is, as we've talked about, we're still looking for some sort of regulatory framework to accomplish that. And the second thing is just collective action. We're in a moment where we're fighting for our survival as a species. It's, things may get more difficult to have conversations like this, and we may have to find collective ways to solve shared problems and find the right house for them. That's my little rant. Okay, who would like to ask? Sorry, yeah, you're the next question. And then anybody after them, because we're running short on time.
Thanks very much. Rob Hubbard here. So I'm really interested in what the panel's view is on Tim Berners-Lee's contract for the web. So a way that we're, to kind of re-empower the individual to take control of our data. Is it something that you see there's worth in? Do you see it being adopted, or is it too late and the genie's out of the bottle?
Who'd like to answer that? Yeah? James?
So I would say I'm a slight hypocrite. So I will talk about security, data privacy, data ethics, and I had to reset a password for something recently, and I realized how many accounts and email addresses are out there in the world about me and where my data is. I think it's really good taking back control, being able to understand the AI, but it's hard. It is really, really hard. So we now need to decide, is that our priority? And be able to put that right at the front of our mind to be able to make a really positive decision and a deliberate decision to go and act on that. We know we should do it, but is it at the top of that pile? I think that's the debate.
Let's bring it this way, Maria, and then Sharif.
Again, an excellent question. I think it's excellent initiatives as long as we find the momentum to become a collective actions. But the worry we have is that the digital world is so utterly complex. Very few people understand its complexity, including team and everyone who's been there from the beginning or work in the sector. The data sharing, a data ecosystem has a complexity that needs to be debunked. Are we ready to educate everyone in society, and where do we start? The education system is not prepared, society is not prepared, media is so and so there. So I think before we think about how useful it is, do we have a collective understanding what's going on? And I think we don't. And we're not going to get that anytime soon. So I agree with you. Is it where we should prioritize, or maybe we'll look back to regulators and legislators? How can we get protection for the ones that either do not care or do not understand?
So I think the way things are now is completely against the individual in the sense that there's no way that people, there's a whole thing with terms and conditions and cookies, acceptance, all of that just doesn't work. Well-intentioned has really completely the wrong solution. And I think the only way, and I think it's important that people have control over their data, have control over, because it's theirs, right? It's not a company or service provider's data. And they, and there I think really, I'm gonna go back to the idea of data trust, I think is potentially a very good solution, because you have that intermediary that has the heft and the technical know-how and all of that, and able to sort of negotiate and protect people's rights on their behalf. I think that's a really good way, really potentially a good way to do it. But as things are now, it's just not working at all.
I think also just to substantiate some of what you guys have said, we've seen in fighting the climate crisis that if it's individualized, then our realm of possibility is limited to not taking a plastic straw, or not buying single-use plastics, or in relation to mental health, if it's down to the individual to make change, then you have to turn to medication, let's say, as opposed to taking collective action and realizing that part of what's triggering a mental health trauma is that you're totally underpaid or overworked, and that's a structural problem that needs addressing. So yeah, in climate and in mental health, I think we need to be mindful of the structural needs, and it's the same in this. It sounds like what you guys are saying is that there's system-level problems that we need to fix as system-level problems. We've got 4 minutes left. Sudan, one comment, yeah.
So I think this is also a really good illustration of why there should be more cross-sector collaboration and also kind of impact management of the unintended consequences, and not really solving the original problem they were trying to solve with this type of regulation. So you have people just clicking through, but it's not really solving the problem with the cookies. So this is again why you should have the government speaking to the companies and also speaking to the users and the end users, and that should be a cycle.
Well said. Okay, so any last questions before? Don't be shy. Okay. Maybe what I'll do then is just ask from each of you a final comment. What are your thoughts? We ended the last panel looking into the future. What do you think going into 2020? Where should this tech for good conversation go? Where would you feel very proud? Actually, I'm gonna phrase it this way in answer to your question of what narratives count here. I've found that talking about legacy, talking about your kids or your grandkids is important, because it actually, the consequences start to become a lot more personal. What would you feel really proud of accomplishing or getting on the table a year from now around tech for good?
So I think for me, one of the things is to really use tech and AI to really sort of ratchet up the fight against the climate crisis. I think in terms of, that links into so many other elements that underpins social cohesion as well. So I think, a specific focus on how we are really using tech to fight climate crisis would be my big hope for 2020.
And just quickly, as BT, are you guys doing anything on that?
Yeah, so we've got lots of different activities in place, and maybe it's also interesting just in the sense of there's already lots of products, even something as simple as teleconferencing, for example. That was not invented to fight the climate crisis, but it's more about cost saving. But actually, one of the huge benefits has been it's saved companies millions of pounds of carbon. So I think what I'd be wanting to see is actually specific products developed to answer the climate crisis, rather than it being a happy byproduct of a product that is developed. So it's that specificity in kind of what you're developing the product for.
So this will be a virtual conference next year, right? Okay.
Well, with 5G it could be, maybe.
Maybe, right. Okay.
So for one of the things that we focus on is collaboration, cross-sector and with government and also with large corporations. So because we're a small organization, so the other way to really spread and scale the message is through collaboration with people who have the power, who have the knowledge, and who have the expertise. So if we can basically spread that and then convert more corporations to have a focus on good and a focus on actually what they do be for good. Like we work with Microsoft and working with Vodafone, and if we can work with more organizations on that.
I think I'd be happy next year if we didn't talk about technology. And it's strange, I have technology in my job title, but it's my least favorite topic. It's why and what are we going to do? I'm so proud of Splunk and working there. The $150 million we've pledged to be able to go and do this, but that's just the beginning. The real big thing is to engage our employees in the world, because they're the people with the creative ideas, the know-how, the why, and be able to really invigorate and get that industrialized so we can really get that going.
This time next year, I would love to see the AI Commons community growing beyond the 60 people we currently have engaged in 20 organizations. So if you're interested, please check our website, the AI Commons, or comment up to me afterwards. Because we believe strongly, as Dean said, that only collaboration can help us solve those humongous problems. And we have already structure in place, we have some assets, but we need much more effort to be able to do it. So collaboration is the key to be able to solve this.
I think the climate crisis is the most important problem facing us. We do a lot of work with analyzing satellite data with machine learning. We want to put that technology in the hands of as many organizations who work on the climate environment as possible.
Great. And even though I asked the question, I'll say my hope for next year is new, and Lord Clement Jones mentioned this as well, new models of corporate personality so that we can actually organize, embed what we're talking about into the organizational expectations of a company. With that, we're going to end. Could I please have a round of applause for our speakers?